So about horror and anime. The horror genre in anime is really similar to comedy. It's really scarce and hard to find a really good quality anime. A lot harder than finding a good quality anime, honestly. For comedy, there's at least a visual attempt that you could see. Lots of animes, including non-comedy ones, at least try to add a little here and there. It's just that for comedy animes, it's hard to find one that's actually good. They all reuse the same skits, and it just never lands. Comedy in anime is a quantity versus quality type of situation, whereas for horror animes, there really is just not much out there. Horror is a really niche genre in the grand scheme of anime. There's only a really small pool of animes that try to commit to horror, and I mean real horror. Not that baby shit. It's something you don't realize you want until you experience it, because in general, you don't really think about horror when you think about anime. The closest thing you will probably see are horror skits, where they have horror, but it plays out in a more comedic way. I think it's mostly because of how much harder it is to translate horror into anime. In manga, there's a much larger pool of mangas you could pick out of. I think horror benefits a lot more from being put in a manga rather than an anime. It's easier to build tension and all those other emotions in a manga versus an anime. Because in an anime, you would have to have the right music, camera positioning, and all that other stuff to get a similar effect that you would have from a horror manga. The Junji Ito series is really a perfect example of this, because it has both a manga and an anime. Junji Ito is probably the sole exception in his genre. He has really the only purely horror manga I've seen that has a pretty big fanbase, which is pretty clear to see why. The dude writes freaky ass horror stories. Detailing is another thing that manga has over anime. Seeing these close-up shots of disfigured humans and all that is really unsettling. The only other manga that gave me a similar feeling was Berserk. It doesn't really count since I wouldn't consider it a horror manga. I like to think generally that I'm not that easy to scare. If you throw a jump scare at me at random, I'll be stone-faced, but it has some crazy ass shots from time to time. I read it in like middle school too. I'm not gonna lie, there were a few times at night where I would just think about the Berserk manga and tense up a bit, just thinking about the creepy creatures and stuff. Some of the stuff in it is hard to digest. If you read the manga, you know how uncomfortable it can be sometimes. The Junji Ito stories give an even more amplified feeling than that, but it's every few panels instead of every couple of chapters, having the stories feel pretty realistic, and then having these supernatural beings pop out of nowhere. He mastered maximizing his panel setup. I don't know if there's a real term for it, but I remember a few anime YouTubers mentioning it, where your eyes naturally read the panel in sections, based on how it's set up, and if you do it the right way, it can build a lot of tension. Then there's the Junji Ito anime, which you would be led to believe should be a scary anime. I mean, if it's adapting one of the most talked about horror manga collections, it would be pretty hard to screw that up with that sort of source material. But they somehow did, unsurprisingly. Besides the first episode, which I thought was pretty good, the anime did pretty much everything I mentioned earlier that you would need to translate a horror manga to an anime. They just didn't do a good job on it. The music wasn't good, the animation was choppy, just pretty much anything that would lose all the tension the manga had. So if you are planning on getting into the series and debating which version you should see it in, just read the manga. Another anime that I discovered that is kind of like the Junji Ito anime is Yami Shibai. It's kind of a mixed bag, honestly. There's around 10 seasons at this point, but each episode is only 5 minutes or so, because they're supposed to be short stories. I watched it up to like season 8 or 9, but I stopped watching it because it just wasn't scary anymore. But to be honest, at least in the earlier seasons, it's a mixed bag. You can see episodes that aren't in the least bit scary. Then they come out with ones that end up giving you goosebumps, so take that as you will. I wouldn't go into it expecting much, but it's better than the Junji Ito collection. The only anime I've seen that's been able to perfectly capture horror is Monster. This was probably my first real horror experience I had in an anime, and so far my only experience. I picked it up on a whim, after hearing it be mentioned in Rant Cafe. I don't watch them too much now, but it's a pretty funny podcast, so check them out if you haven't heard about them. But I ended up picking it up, and it definitely exceeded my expectations. I don't really know why it's not that known. I mean, it's kind of old, so it makes sense that less people would come up on it. But the older animation makes it even better. Like way better, honestly. It's the only anime I can say benefits from that older style. I don't want to say too much about it though. Let's just say that it's about a doctor and a patient. It's a little bit annoying that shows like these aren't getting any attention, but your Isekai 20.0s get so much. Even the openings and endings are relevant to the story, to an extent. It has one of the top endings I've seen in any anime. Not really for the fact that I think the music is catchy or anything, but how it adds to the anime story. It just leaves this feeling and makes me sit there and digest what I watched, and then makes me want to go and watch the next episode. An ending that people can probably relate to that gives a similar feeling is the York New ending in Hunter x Hunter. The ending really gave goosebumps. Having the anime have some crazy shit happen, and then how it transitioned into the ending was always perfect. If you know what I'm describing with Hunter x Hunter, it's literally that, but instead of excitement, it's a mix of confusion, sadness, just a whole lot of emotions depending on the episode. So if you haven't watched Monster, and you didn't get the hint, you should definitely watch it. I have yet to find a really good horror anime ever since watching it. If you know any that are monster level good, definitely let me know. But yeah, that is more or less all I had to say about horror and anime. If you enjoyed, check out my other video where I talk about anime streaming platforms, or anything on the channel that interests you. But yeah, that's all I had to say. Peace.